Hey guys, it's Justin back with an engineer's perspective, and today we've got a discussion on the steel in this knife, S110V, made by Crucible. It is kind of the top dog in stainless steel right now. Certainly whatever's done in production. I think it's been probably most popularized by Spyderco, which is what we have here, a Spyderco Paramilitary 2. Spyderco does production runs of S110V and the PM2 Para 3 Military, Native Lightweight, Mannix 2, and Mannix 2 Lightweight, I think is all of them. So a lot of options. I don't know anybody else that's really working with it. I think manufacturers have kind of here and there, but nobody on the level of Spyderco, not even close. So what's the deal with S110V? Why is it cool? Why is it not cool? And why might you want to pick it? Well, let's take a look. So I smartly put S110V inconveniently in the middle instead of, left to right, but we're going to work with it. So we're going to start with the composition. You're going to quickly see that S110V is not screwing around. So up front, we've got our carbon at 2.8 weight percent. And carbon is used for hardening the steel, of course, but it also is going to combine with some of the elements in here to form carbides. We'll get to that. So you've got a huge dollop, 15.25% of chromium. That's going to be in large part for stainlessness, because the chromium that doesn't get bound into the carbon gets left out in the steel matrix so that oxygen can combine with it, making chromium oxide on the surface, and that's what prevents rust from happening. You've got a little bit of cobalt here. I think that's added into the steel for a couple of reasons. One, I think, is it does help with heat treating the steel, making it a little bit easier to harden it. And number two is for hot working hardness. S110V is a tool steel. I think people think of D2 when they think of tool steels, but this isn't meant for a knife. This is meant to be in some sort of drill bit or whatever. Not drill bit, but tooling. So it's going to get hot. So they put a little bit of that in there to prevent it from softening when it heats up. Now you've got molybdenum. I think that's mostly for stainlessness. Once again, molybdenum is like chromium that'll add to stainlessness, but it won't soak up the carbon to form carbides quite like chromium will, not in these amounts anyways. I've never seen a super high molybdenum steel, honestly, past 4 or 5%. Move all the way down to here to niobium. Niobium is a carbide former. It forms some of the hardest carbides and some of the finest carbides, just like its neighbor down here, vanadium, also just for carbide formation. And for those that don't know, all a carbide is when carbon, hence carbide, combines with another molecule. You just call it a carbide. But the bonds between the carbon and that other molecule are very strong, and you generate something that's super duper hard. And when you've got a very hard particle bound up in this steel matrix, it adds to wear resistance, because when you're cutting through cardboard, the cardboard can't abrade it very quickly. It slows down the wear, hence wear resistance. Generally, the more carbides you have, they'll add to hardness of a steel as well. So yeah, that's the composition there. Let's just kind of do a quick comparison to some of its neighbors here. So I've got S30V. So quick things to note: way less carbon. That means, as a ratio to the other things that'll soak up carbon, it has a lot less potential for getting hard and a lot less potential to forming carbides. It's got a similar amount of chromium, but less, and way less vanadium and no niobium. So you can see something in S30V is that just doesn't have the chemistry to form these ridiculous amounts of carbides, especially these hard carbides down here. Moving over to something like M390, which I think is a really good comparison to S110V. M390 is another steel that was developed as a stainless tool steel, and the intention was stainlessness. But, and Larry Thomas likes to go on I don't know if I'll call it a rant, but he does not like M390, and it's for this reason. S110V was very well thought out in terms of maximizing stainlessness and wear resistance, whereas M390, they basically just threw a bunch of chromium into it without adjusting the amount of vanadium or carbon or anything. And what you get is a steel that has the potential to form lots of carbides, but it forms a lot of these chromium carbides. And the problem with chromium carbides is they are not nearly as hard as these vanadium and niobium carbides, meaning that you get less bang for your buck in terms of wear resistance. And not only that, for every carbide you form, you reduce the steel's toughness a little bit. But chromium carbide is a much worse offender than niobium or vanadium carbides, meaning that because they went the route of all this chromium, you form a lot of these detrimental chromium carbides, whereas if they would have just formed something like these guys down here, they would have been a lot further ahead. And we'll look at that down here. On to CPM-10V, that'd be this guy over here. So 10V is another tool steel. The S30V is the only one in here that's not. It was actually the first CPM steel. And this is an example of what happens if you kind of make this as good as you can. Because when you make these steels stainless, you're compromising, because you're going to be forming those chromium carbides that reduce toughness, that aren't going to give you the same edge retention. So I wanted to put in something here like S1 or CPM-10V, where it does have chromium in here, but it does not form chromium carbides at that level. And really this carbon is for hardness and to match up to this huge dollop of vanadium down here, forming a bunch of vanadium carbide. That's kind of the chemistry breakdown. Let's look at the hardnesses I've got up there super quick. These are general factory heat treats that we see. So right off the bat, if you compare S30V to S110V, I'm basing this off what I see from Spyderco. They seem to be always above 60 on this, versus S30V seems to usually be running that 58 to 60 range. So if you're somebody that appreciates what you get out of hardness, which is longer wear resistance, thinner edges, more upfront sharpness, S110V is probably already going to be your good bet. And that's definitely what I've seen with this knife here. M390, I see it in a wide range. You know, I think a lot of companies do maybe even softer than 58 Rockwell, which is just absolutely pointless. But you do have some companies like, imagine that, another Spyderco. This one is probably in the 61 range, where it really does perform pretty well. But you have a wide range, so be careful with M390. In 10V, most people that work with it do it semi-justice, 63 to 65 Rockwell. I think this one's probably in the 63, 64 range. And you think, oh wow, that's so hard for a steel that has such high carbide volume. But now let's take a look down here. So starting at S30V, so I've got the total carbide volume here, and then this is the part of it that's vanadium or niobium carbides. Remembering that the vanadium and niobium carbides are the more favorable ones that are going to add more to edge retention and the least amount to toughness reduction. So for 14.5%, and these are all estimates, by the way, and then there's information from here. For S30V, you get 14.5% carbide volume, but only 4% is vanadium carbide. So it means you have 10.5% of chromium carbide, and it's vanadium enhanced chromium carbide, but I think that's outside the scope of this initial quick discussion here. So only 4% of that is actual awesome vanadium carbide. Look at S110V. You've got 27 total percent, and 15% of this is vanadium and niobium carbides. So they very carefully selected the amount of chromium and molybdenum carbon, niobium, and vanadium to really maximize this number as high as they could. I do want to note that these numbers here are from Laren Thomas, but he notes that they are from thermocalc, and when he experimentally tested S125V, which should have higher carbide volume than S110V, these were the same numbers he got. So these are probably high estimates, just as an FYI, but they're probably relatively close. So as a fraction, only less than a third of S30V's carbide volume is vanadium carbide, whereas over half of S110V is the vanadium carbide. So you can see what kind of an amazing accomplishment that is, honestly. And furthermore, let's look at M390, which is just atrocious. It's got 20% total carbide volume, so it will outcut S30V. But here's the deal. Only 2.5% vanadium carbide. So it's actually got less vanadium carbide than S30V does. And that's because they so inefficiently designed this steel. It doesn't use all 4% of that in making making vanadium carbide. So it's just not a very efficient steel. It forms a lot of carbide. It forms a lot of it as chromium carbide, meaning that for your dollar your edge retention is not going to be as good for that wear resistance level. It's just not an efficient ratio. And then down to S1 or CPM-10V so you got 17% carbide volume, and every drop of that is vanadium carbide, and that's because it's designed that way. It has no detriments of having to finagle with chromium in there. And all of these were designed prior to Magna Cut, where they were perfectly balanced in terms of trying to maximize your vanadium carbide. So you can see that S110V really is in a class of its own. It has almost as much vanadium carbide as 10V does, which is just so impressive. Now let's move over to the toughness. So these are all normalized to 61 Rockwell. So you can see that S30V has about 5 foot-pounds. And you go down to S110V, which has double the carbide volume, a little bit less, but it only has a moderate sacrifice down to 4 foot-pounds. So once again, pretty marvelous what they're able to accomplish with S110V, to have that much carbide volume and to only have that kind of reduction in toughness. It's really amazing. And now you look at M390, however, you have way less carbide volume than S110V. You have way less vanadium carbide than S110V, and yet it's the same toughness. That's because it's just not an efficiently designed steel. Does it perform well? It does, but are there steels that perform a heck of a lot better? Yeah. Excuse me. And then last is 10V. This is what you get when you don't go stainless, is you get double the toughness of S30V at higher amounts of carbide. So that's the efficient of going straight vanadium carbide, is you get a way tougher steel, meaning you can go a lot harder, you can go a lot thinner edges. And that's why I prefer 10V the most out of this group here. So that's kind of the science behind it, and I want to talk super briefly about the practicality of it. What is it like to actually use S110V? So up front is, in my mind, I was kind of comparing this to S30V, because from Spyderco, it's really a choice you get to make. You can buy the base model S30V version, or you can buy the upgraded S110V version. And S110V feels and acts and performs in every way better than S30V. Absolutely. The front end sharpness lasts longer. The working edge lasts way longer. It's a much higher quality working edge because of that vanadium carbide develops that kind of working edge plus, is what I call it. Huge upgrade over S30V. Very notable. I don't see why you wouldn't choose S110V over S30V personally, but everybody's tastes differ. I think two things that are going to scare people about S110V is what that hardness and that carbide volume, there's no way I'm going to be able to sharpen it. And that's one thing that really surprised me. I think these are hitting closer to 60 than 62. This did not feel very much different than S30V on the stones. It really didn't. It moved pretty quick. Yeah, it feels a lot like S30V until the end. The stories of S110V not wanting to get as sharp at the very end are a little bit true, in the sense that, you know, S30V doesn't beg for a screaming edge like something like Crewwear seems to do. But S30V takes a sharper edge easier than S110V. You really got to do your work at the end to get that last little bit of sharpness, is what I found. Because I did 4 sharpenings on this total. The first 3 were my normal, just like, you know, quick whip it out, no big deal. I was able to strop it up to the sharpness that I wanted to usually, but it wasn't quite where I wanted it to be. So on the last sharpening, when I sharpened it up to return it to who I borrowed this from, I really took my time. I went through a full progression. I don't know if you need to do the full progression, but I took my time, especially at the end, and it came up real beautiful, real sharp, real fine. So it definitely can do that, but it does take a little bit more work. So do I like S110V? For a stainless steel, I do like it. Do I love it enough where I would buy it personally? I don't think so. For me, when I think stainless, honestly, I usually go to LC200N because it sharpens up amazing. And if I want edge retention and high performance, I just go to 10V or K390. So for me, S110V is a worthwhile upgrade to S30V, and I do like it, but I personally won't be picking up any after I return this to its owner. So that's all I've got for you. Thank you for watching. Have a good one. Bye.